You know, one of the dream jobs in TV journalism is to be a correspondent for 60 Minutes. And Scott Pelley has been living that dream for the past 15 years. And if that wasn't enough, Scott also has doubled during some of that time as anchor of the CBS Evening News, serving in that role from 2011 to 2017. These plum assignments mark the apex of a career in broadcast news that stretches back more than 45 years, starting with stints on several TV stations in Texas. At CBS, which Scott joined in 1989, he first worked out of bureaus in New York, Dallas, and elsewhere before being named chief White House correspondent in 1997 and eventually moving to 60 Minutes. Scott has won many awards for his work, including a record 38 Emmys, nearly all of them for his stories on 60 Minutes. In fact, those pieces have accounted for half of all the major awards won by the program since Scott joined it. Now he's written his first book, Truth Worth Telling, which combines personal reflections on his accomplished career with inspiring accounts of some of the people he's met and covered, all organized under chapter headings named after virtues like gallantry, resolve, selflessness, authenticity, and devotion. At a time when major news organizations in this country are under attack from Donald Trump and his supporters, Scott's book provides a persuasive defense of journalism and its importance to our democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Scott Pelley.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. These book tours are a little brutal. I got up at 3 o'clock this morning in New York so that I could be here, and I cannot tell you how comfortable that chair is. It is absolutely sensational, and in fact, I was thinking about doing all this from the chair. I'm so grateful that you're all here. I see a number of friends in the room. I'm so grateful that you're here as well. You know, I was covering when I was anchoring the evening news, I was covering one night the attack of ISIS on Paris, which many of you may recall killed 120 people in one attack there. And I was watching on a rainy night people bringing candles to a makeshift memorial on a cobblestone street, and there were children and there were women and there were men all bringing their candles out there silently. And I was watching them, and after this long career that I've had, I thought, I've seen these people before. I recognize their faces. I saw them at the World Trade Center on 9/11. I saw them in Oklahoma City after the Murrah Federal Building was bombed. They all had the same expression on their face, kind of a sense of, what's the meaning of life? And it dawned on me in that moment that maybe we're asking the wrong question. Don't ask the meaning of life. Life is asking, what's the meaning of you? And so I began to think about all the people that I had met in my career, some of them famous and some of them you've never heard of, who discovered the meaning of their lives, usually in moments of great historic importance. And I decided to sit down and write about that. I wanted to write a memoir, but I didn't want to write a memoir about me, because I knew no one would care about that. If I started with, I was born in 1957 in San Antonio, Texas, and then there were another 500 pages beyond that, no one was going to be interested in that. But I did realize that I had met the most extraordinary people in the world during these great events. And as Brad just mentioned, most of the chapters in the book are named after virtues and the specific virtues of these characters that I've talked about in the book. I'd like to read to you from the first chapter of the book, which is entitled Gallantry. And it's about 9/11, and it's about what I witnessed at the World Trade Center when the buildings came down. And the chapter is about and dedicated to the 343 members of the fire department of the city of New York who were killed that day. 343. It's the largest loss of life of any emergency service in the history of the world in a single event. One of the things that's interesting about being the eyewitness to these historic events is that when you're an eyewitness to these things, you actually don't know very much. All you know is what you see, and that's not much. But what I was able to do in this story about 9/11 and all the other stories in the book, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and many others, was to take all of the material that has been discovered over time and use that to inform what I had seen with my own eyes. All of the engineering studies that were done by the federal government about why the buildings fell down. No steel structure had ever collapsed because of fire in the history of the world. That's why those firemen were in those buildings. I didn't expect it to collapse. None of the senior officers down there at the command post they'd never seen a building collapse because of fire. But as we go through in the book, there were special circumstances here that made the impossible suddenly tragically real. But anyway, I went back through all of these materials. I went back through all of the radio transmissions on all the fire frequencies, some of which had been lost after that day and were only discovered years later. I went back through the engineering studies of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They wrote 53 engineering reports on why the buildings collapsed when they shouldn't have and exactly how that happened. So taking all of this wealth of information, the 911 calls from people inside the towers, I was able to really inform what it was that I had seen with my own eyes, which was the collapse of the towers themselves. This anecdote I'm going to read to you from is one of those instances in which I was able to take some of this historical data discovered years after the event and match up two timelines that had never been linked before. One is a telephone call from a woman named Melissa Doy. She's 32 years old. She's a financial analyst. She's on the 83rd floor of the World Trade Center tower. She's calling a 911 operator, and their telephone call lasts almost half an hour. In going through the timeline of the FDNY radio transmissions, I discovered that at exactly these same moments, just below Missy Doy, there was a battalion chief by the name of Oreo Palmer, Battalion 7 chief, and he was rising through the stairwell, going up the stairwells at a floor a minute, carrying all of his emergency equipment and leading all the other firemen behind him. So this is just a short passage from Truth Worth Telling, the first chapter called Gallantry. At the moment the 911 operator answered her call, Doy can be overheard nearing the end of the Hail Mary prayer. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. 911 operator, good day. I'm on the 83rd floor. I'm on the 83rd floor, Doy shouted into the phone. The nose of United Flight 175 had hit 2 floors below her. Part of the right wing ripped into Doy's 83rd floor. The 24-minute conversation between Melissa Candida Doy and a 911 operator is among the few in which we have the caller's words. When the 911 calls were released years after the event, the city of New York took all of the caller's words off of the recordings and the transcripts. So all you hear is the 911 operator, except for in this one case, and I'll continue. The recording was entered into evidence in the 2006 federal trial of Zacharias Moussaoui, a Frenchman who ultimately pleaded guilty to conspiring with the 9/11 hijackers. Moussaoui will spend the rest of his days in the federal Supermax prison in Colorado. Ma'am, how you doing? The operator speaking to Missy Doy was a woman. Listening to the recording, I suspect she's middle-aged and experienced. Her voice is earnest and empathetic. Are you going to be able to get somebody up here? Doy asked. I'm struck by the youth in Doy's pleading soprano. Of course, ma'am. We're coming up to you. Well, there's no one here yet, and the floor is completely engulfed. We're on the floor, and we can't breathe, and it's very, very, very hot. The operator was right. There was a firefighter rising toward Doy. Chief Oreo Palmer of Battalion 7 was well known for his unusual first name, which, of course, earned him the moniker Cookie. Now, let me skip ahead. After 37 flights of stairs, Palmer was finally out of breath. The horror of the 78th floor added an edge to his voice. Palmer keyed his mic to request that his next radio message be passed on to the incident command post. Radio, that 78th floor, numerous 1045 code 1s. They were fatalities, more than he could count, strewn across the 78th floor. The 4 floors above 78 were heavily damaged. The nearest survivors to Palmer were likely 5 floors above him on 83, including Missy Doy and her 5 co-workers. "I'm going to die, aren't I?" Doy said to the operator. No. Say I'm going to die. Ma'am, say your prayers, the operator counseled. "I'm going to die," Doy repeated. In the recording, I do not hear panic. Her voice sounds as though she had come to a realization. "I'm going to die" was self-empathy, reconciling with the inevitable. The 2 women on the telephone line, strangers who would never meet, formed an intimate bond. "We've got to think positive," the operator urged, "because we have to help each other get off this floor. Stay calm. "Please, God," Doy called out. "You're doing a good job, ma'am. You're doing a good job." "It's so hot. I'm burning up," Doy said. Then she asked whether her mother could be patched into the call. The operator explained she had no way of making a third-party connection. 5 floors below, Oreo Palmer began directing the firefighting attack. He radioed the men of Ladder 15 who were still headed up. "I'm going to need your firefighters. Adams Stairway to knock down 2 fires. Get a house line," that's a connection to a building standpipe. "Get the house line stretched. We can get some water on it and knock it down." Palmer had discovered the only stairwell that was intact above the point of impact. If he could extinguish the fire in Stairway A, more than 600 people would have a way out. Ladder 15 replied, "All right, 10-4. We're coming up the stairs. We're on 77 now on the B stair. We'll be right to you." Before this recording was discovered, investigators had estimated that firefighters had reached no higher than 50 floors. "Battalion 9, I need you on the floor above 79, Palmer advised his fellow chief. "We have access stairs going up to 79. "All right, I'm on my way up, Oreo," Battalion 9 responded. At 9:57 a.m., it appears that the one elevator stopped working. A member of Ladder 15, trapped in the elevator shaft, radioed, "You're going to have to get a different elevator. We're chopping through the wall to get out." Other members of Ladder 15 were stuck in a stairwell. "Oreo," one of them called on the radio, "we're on 78, but we're in the B stairway, trapped in here. We're going to have to put some fire out to get to you." Wait, we hear voices," Melissa Doy reported to the 911 operator. "Hello, help," she shouted into the burning room. Then she screamed, "Help, help." Doy asked the operator, "Can you find out if there's anyone on the 83rd floor? We think we heard somebody." What Doy heard is unknown, but based on the records that I have studied, it is plausible that Oreo Palmer and perhaps some of the men of Ladder 15 continued climbing the intact Stairway A, fighting the fire as they rose. Having received no answer, Doy returned to the call. Can you stay on the line with me, please? I feel like I'm dying." "Are they inside with you yet, dear?" the operator asked. "No," Doy said. "Can you find out where they are? Can..." That was Missy Doy's last word. By my count, the operator called her name without response more than 60 times over the next 13 minutes. Before Oreo Palmer could reach above the 79th floor, the building began to lose its will to survive. What the fire chiefs down below did not know and could not have known was that the impact of the aircraft had knocked the fire insulation off of the steel. Steel becomes plastic and begins to lose its strength at about 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, and the jet fuel fires were burning in there at about 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. When I got to the World Trade Center, I was really experiencing, to tell you the truth, kind of a sense of joy, because I saw that the buildings were still standing. And I thought, okay, well, there's a chance. People are going to get out of there. And I was looking in particular at Tower Number 1, which had the big mast, the big radio and television antenna on top. And it looked to me like the antenna was going back and forth like a metronome. And I thought, well, that can't be. And I thought it was maybe just the heat torturing the light and causing an optical illusion. But what happened in the next moment was the building began to crumble. You've heard people say that they've experienced traumatic events as if they were in slow motion. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is what happens. When I saw the building start to come down, it looked to me like one floor collapsed and stopped, and then the next, and then the next. And I thought, in man's inexhaustible ability to fool himself, I thought, well, it'll stop. It's just going to come down so far, and then it'll stop. But of course, what all of you saw on television was the building just rushing to the ground with heartbreaking speed. I don't remember doing this, but in the next moment, I find myself on my knees and in prayer, and I asked God out loud to take all those people without pain. I don't remember getting up. The next thing I remember is I'm in motion, running as fast as I can with a crowd of other people, with the sound of steel hitting the street behind me. I don't know when I stopped running. I just know that it occurred to me at some point that the collapse had ended, and that what I needed to do was turn around and go back in there so that I could report what I had seen. And that's exactly what I did. CBS News was on the air for 96 hours without a break, no commercials, all day, all night, 96 hours. Why did we do that? Because reliable, accurate information is the lifeblood of a democracy every day, and so important during a time of national crisis. We were working like hell to sort out fact from fiction. And as all of you recall, there was a lot of fiction that day, too. There were a lot of wild rumors about things that never happened. One of the chapters in the book is called To a Young Journalist, in which I make the case that there is no democracy without journalism. Why is that? Well, the founders, right, gave us the power over the government. But we can't exercise that power unless we have independent, reliable information. One of the things, and we talk about this in the book, that worries me the most about our beloved country is this. What's the fastest way to destroy a democracy? Is it terrorism? Is it war? Is it a Great Depression? I don't think so. I think the fastest way to destroy a democracy is to poison the information. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now from hostile nation states, from cynical actors here in the United States. We have gone seamlessly and unnoticed by many people from the information age to the disinformation age. I'm terribly worried about our country in that scenario. Totalitarian states, Russia and China, they don't have to worry about that. They control their media. They don't have to worry about that kind of thing taking over the thoughts and minds of their people. But democracies do, because of the special way that democracies are set up. So, one of the arguments that I make in the book is about this new age that we live in and some of the measures that we can take, particularly young journalists can take, to protect our country from this menace. I hope in this point in my career that I could be a stepping stone for that next generation of young journalists. There's no democracy without journalism, and we desperately need young journalists to join our ranks and to be really good at what we do, because the quality of our democracy is directly tied to the quality of our journalism. You know, James Madison wrote that freedom of the press is the right that guarantees all the others. And when Madison used the word press, he used it liberally. He really meant all of us, everyone. Madison understood that if we had the right to say what we want to say, write what we want to write, read what we want to read, then all of our rights would be protected by that. And so the stakes are just that high. It's just that important. I'd like to read to you again, before we start taking your questions, another few pages of the book. This had to do with the fight for freedom inside China. In 1997, I became the chief White House correspondent. I was covering the Clinton White House, the second term, the impeachment, and all of that. But this is about the president's state visit to China. I had a young producer in those days by the name of Bill Owens, who was my producer at the White House. Bill and I have been together a long time. We've been in wars together in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've been through a lot together. Bill was recently made the executive producer of 60 Minutes. So Bill used to work for me, and now I work for him. Be nice to the young people on your way up, right? So we wanted to interview one Chinese dissident in particular, is a man named Bao Tong. And Bao had been the chief of staff to the Chinese president in the days leading up to Tiananmen Square. He was dead set against sending the army in to murder those students in the square. And so when the hardliners decided to do just that, 2 or 3 days before they sent the army in, they arrested Bao and put him in prison in solitary confinement, where he languished for many years. As President Clinton is going to China, Bao had been released only months before. Well, I want to interview this guy. Now, after all these years in solitary confinement, right? How eager do you think he is to appear on CBS News and decry this government that had just put him away? Well, you would be surprised. He was very eager to do it, but there was an enormous problem. He was under 24/7 surveillance by Chinese secret police. There was no way they were ever going to let us get anywhere near him. I wasn't going to be doing what I usually do, and that is set up cameras in a hotel room and ask our guests to come in and sit down with us. They would never allow that. So Bill and Natalie Liu, our Beijing bureau chief, came up with a scheme that unfolded on that summer's day, and I'll start with that. Bill Owens designed a plan that would unfold in Purple Bamboo Park, a 115-acre oasis of lakes and lawns in northwest Beijing, an affluent part of the capital where universities are clustered. When we arrived in the park, summer was blossoming. The sky was gauzed by high cirrus. Families in canopied boats drifted through groves of lotus, propelled by gondoliers, sculling red oars in a lazy rhythm. One boy, pleased with his cleverness, plucked a broad lotus flower and raised it against the sun like a parasol. Along the edges of the park's concrete trails, bamboo pickets were set up to keep visitors off the carefully tended greens. The gardens that later became Purple Bamboo Park were originally ordered in the year 1577 by Wan Li, the 13th emperor of the Ming Dynasty. On June 27, 1998, Bao Tong ambled down one of the pathways in the park and settled onto the green wooden bench. Across the path, directly opposite Bao, our cameraman, Raleigh Maliksi, sat with a camera hidden in a shoulder bag. I came from the opposite direction and sat with Bao. A nearly invisible wireless microphone pinned inside my shirt transmitted our conversation across the path to Raleigh's recorder. There was no telling what would happen as the soft-spoken man risked everything to test his people's right to be heard. Bao was 59 when he went to prison for revealing state secrets and counter-revolutionary propagandizing. That's the same ambiguous charge China uses to jail journalists today. Despite prison, Bao looked younger than his 66 years. He was as slender as the reeds nodding in the lake. He wore a teal polo shirt, untucked, hanging loosely over black trousers. His smooth face was dominated by outsized silver wire-rimmed glasses. I had noticed that Bao tended to walk, holding his arms behind his back as if handcuffed. He surprised me with a complete lack of bitterness about his years in solitary. He said isolation had liberated his mind from Communist Party dogma. Bao began, "According to our Constitution, I have the freedom of speech. However, whether I do indeed have the freedom of speech, I do not know. I think CBS can conduct a test. Let's see whether I get into trouble after your interview with me. If so, it will demonstrate that our government does not respect its own Constitution." What should Americans understand about the struggle in China? I asked. If people can check and balance the power of the government, then the government can be a force that safeguards world peace. Otherwise, it is a dangerous force. Bao told me that China would not progress politically until the party publicly admitted the Tiananmen massacre was wrong. I felt sad, ashamed, and proud at the same time, he told me. Proud of those students, the citizens of Beijing, the people. After a few minutes, we parted. Bao ambled away. I walked in the opposite direction. That's when I noticed, out of the corner of my eye, another cameraman with a shoulder bag. From the zipper opening protruded an absurdly large lens. He was a member of a Chinese secret police surveillance team. Bill, Natalie, and I quickened our pace slightly, but deliberately. A moment later, I saw a furious man sprinting toward us. He was red with rage and closing fast. We began an undignified trot, but the man kept accelerating and screaming, now waving a fist. I began wondering about Chinese jails as we broke into a full run. The man matched our pace. Natalie and I were falling short of breath when I shouted, "What's he saying? What's he saying?" She replied, "He's saying, keep off the grass." If you hang around in this business long enough, every conceivable thing happens to you. So there are many chapters in the book named after virtues, many people that I met. There's a chapter that's called Selflessness about a nurse that I met, Paulette Shank, in the Air Force Theater Hospital in Balad, Iraq, where our most severely wounded troops come in. I was there in the emergency room one day, a tent, but filled with the most sophisticated medical equipment and the best doctors from all over America. When a young Marine came in, he'd been hit by a mortar blast, and he was bleeding from 3 arteries, and he was very nearly dead. They rushed him right into the OR. I went right in behind him. They started working on him, and he had a 5-hour surgery. They had to take one of his legs that they couldn't repair. And at a certain point, a nurse came into the OR and said, "We're out of blood." All the fresh blood in the blood bank had run through this young man's heart and spilled out on the floor of the operating room. Paulette Shank, who was in charge of the operating rooms, said, "I'll get more." And I thought, well, what is she talking about? There isn't any more. She just told us there isn't any more. So I followed Paulette Shank out to the next tent, which is the blood bank, right? By the time I got there, she had opened up her own veins and was bleeding into bags that they were taking into the operating room. This bought just enough time for them to put out an all call on the base loudspeaker, and in like 3 minutes, there were 100 people in line giving blood in the blood bank. And they saved this young man's life. I met him 3 months later here in Washington at Walter Reed. And that chapter, as I said, is called Selflessness. So some of the people in this book, Bruce Springsteen, presidents, would-be presidents, are famous, but a lot of people like Lieutenant Colonel Paulette Shank, who's in real life a nurse at a hospital in Pennsylvania, are people that you never heard of. But they discovered the meaning of their lives in these moments of great history. Now, I understand that you may have a few questions. Goodness, I hope so. And we have a microphone on each end. If you're able to get to the mic, please do. And if you're unable to get to the mic, I'll just repeat your question really loud, like a reporter on TV. And I'll be very happy to take your questions, anything and everything. I've heard them all, maybe. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what happened to the courageous Chinese guy that you interviewed?
I'm so glad you asked. Thank you. It's all in the book, but I'm so glad you asked. No, it's such an important point. I'm really thrilled that you asked. I should not have left this out. I learned a lot about the invisible hand of the Chinese security apparatus. Answer to your question is nothing. Nothing happened to Bao. Nothing happened to me. Nothing happened to Bill Owens. Nothing happened for 3 months. And then the Chinese secret police kicked in the door of Natalie Liu's apartment while she was getting her children ready for school, handcuffed her, drug her off to prison, took all of her notes and tapes and everything, and confiscated all of those things. She was gone. And the family had no idea what had happened to her. By this time, I'm traveling with the president in Ireland. And I went to the National Security Advisor and I said, "Hey, I know we don't always get along here, but you've got to help me out. Natalie Liu, arrested by the Chinese, etc." I don't know what happened. I don't know if that request is what triggered the events of the next few days. But Natalie was deported from China to the United States with her family, where she had a long and illustrious career at Voice of America here in Washington. So it was just very, very interesting. They didn't do a thing for 3 months, and then they wanted to send a message that next time there were American reporters in town, you shouldn't be helping them. And Bao is still alive and living in Beijing. His son now lives in nominally independent Hong Kong, and he has a bookstore. He sells what would be described as counter-revolutionary books in a bookstore that's all about freedom in Hong Kong. And frankly, it probably can't last much longer because, as everyone knows, they're turning the screws on Hong Kong pretty consistently these days. Yes, please.
Hi. First, thank you so much for being here at what I hope is nearing the end of a very, very long day for you. So I'm very much looking forward to reading the book, but many of the history-making moments you cover are also the worst moments of people's lives. You talk to people when they're at their most vulnerable. I work with young journalists and do education and training for them. I'm wondering what you would say to young journalists about how they can turn those moments, as you have in the book, into positive, restorative moments instead of extractive ones. Thank you.
Do you mean turn the story into a positive thing, or try to bring something positive into their own personal lives?
Into their own lives, because I imagine it must be very difficult for them to tell those stories at those worst moments.
It is. And there is a very, very short thing in here. Between the chapters, there are little anecdotes, like a page and a half or 2 pages, that I call field notes. And one of them is a field note that I wrote about empathy. Let me see, where is it? It's very short. It's 1 page. If this responds directly to your question, I'll be happy to elaborate. Kabul was a desolate ruin when I arrived during the U.S. military campaign in October 2001. Once, the city's river was described in the Rig Veda, a Hindu text from 1200 BC, as beautiful, fair to see. But all I could see was a vision of Dante's seventh circle of hell. The civil war that began in 1992 and ended with Taliban control in 1996 destroyed 80% of Kabul. Now, with the fall of the Taliban, 3 million people scavenged the remains of grotesque privation. The economy, security, even dignity had collapsed. The most destitute were widows, covered head to toe in sky blue burqas overcast with filth. Bound by the chains of Taliban piety, even their eyes were covered by gauze-like screens. Because the Taliban forbade women to work, and because their husbands had been killed in the war, the widows could only beg in the streets. After the U.S. rid Kabul of its totalitarian masters, homeless women were no longer beaten by the roving goons of the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, but hunger had starved them of their humanity. The moment I stepped from my car, I was swarmed by desperate souls. 4 veiled figures pulled at my clothes and gripped my arms and legs as though I was a lone timber in a rolling sea. The Afghan capital had become a feral frenzy. Their shrieking, their despair, broke my heart. I was on my way to Bagram Air Force Base to link up with U.S. Army Special Forces. I fumbled for the few Afghani bills I had in my pocket, but these women were determined to go with me, wherever that may be. I peeled fingers back, one by one, and escaped into the car. Starving, shrouded ghosts beat the roof and howled as we pulled away. Empathy is the greatest gift a reporter can possess, but the gift is not free. Reporters are haunted by memories, the faces of, or in Kabul, the hands of souls that he or she cannot make whole. With empathy, we explore, we understand, but in the bargain, the grip of tragedy is never peeled away. All of that to say, it is an occupational hazard. I didn't appreciate until years later that I suffered with post-traumatic stress syndrome, depression, anxiety from 9/11, from watching those buildings come at me. And so then you go to Afghanistan. I went to Iraq 26 times. I went to Afghanistan 10 times. And so these things do begin to wear on you, and it's a very important thing that when I was young, we didn't talk about in J school. And I think it's a very important thing to help young people first and foremost by informing them of this so that they know what to look for and they need to take care of themselves. My wife of almost 36 years now has been taking care of me this whole time, and having a strong family relationship is unbelievably helpful in all of these things. But young people do need to be aware of that. Empathy, I speak of in the book. I mean, it's the greatest asset that a writer can have, right? When you have empathy, you can wear the clothes of the people that you're writing about and understand them well. But boy, that is a double-edged sword. So thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you for your work.
Yes, sir.
Scott, thank you very much for being here. And thank you for writing the book. I've got it yesterday. And when I first saw you, got aware that you were anchoring news in 2011 on CBS, I said, if that's not Vince Scully, I don't know who it is. And because it was like you were the head of the dining room table, and we were all invited to listen to you give the news.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you.
And I'm a little bit older than you, but I remember in 1970, they had the age of Aquarius, and a lot of entertainers would do a TV ad way before cable. But over the past 3 decades, it's been the age of disrespect. Disrespect to the baseball fan, disrespect to the voter, disrespect from a certain newspaper towards a certain team. And I remember seeing a young lady at Union Station, and she saw the original hat, 2005. I said, you are wearing America's most important uniform. And she broke down in tears.
You know, let me elaborate on that a little bit. I'm glad you brought this up, because this is the other thing that concerns me about our dear country. I fear that at this moment, many Americans are withdrawing into digital citadels of confirming information. What I mean by that is people on the right are listening to the right-wing media, people on the left are listening to the left-wing media, and they're hearing confirming information. They're being told that what they already think is right. And boy, that's a warm feeling. That's a great feeling. But in that way, I fear that we may be moving toward a new Cold War, but this time a cold civil war. You know, there are no American flags with just the stars of the conservative states. There are no American flags with just the stars of the liberal states. How many stars are on the American flag? There are 50. And they're all there together. And that blue square in the flag is called the Union. And it's not called the Union for nothing. And it seems to me that we as Americans, we need to come back into that mainstream, a word that has become pejorative somehow. I want to be in the mainstream. I don't want to be on some tributary off to the left or the right somewhere. I want to be right there in the mainstream with most American people. But we all have to meet on that blue field, and we have to have conversations with one another, and we have to understand that we are not going to agree on some things, but on a lot of things we will. And that's how you move, not left, not right, but forward. And that, I'm so glad you brought that up, because Americans withdrawing into these digital citadels, as I call them, that is no way to run a democracy. In fact, that is why democracies were invented, to take in the views of a large number of people and figure out a way to manage the differences. We're beginning to forget how to manage the differences. Yes, ma'am.
I'm going back to your earlier comment on being on the ground on 9/11 and running away from the event of the building falling, and then turning around, you said going back into the fray to report. So my question is, were you there when Building 7, which has aroused enormous controversy?
Have you read the book?
Yes.
Because I write about Building 7 in the book.
No, I haven't read your book yet. Yeah, were you there when it fell? Because there's so much controversy around the timing, the countdown, Silverstein saying pull it, all of that, and the fact that it looked like an implosion.
I would direct, I'll tell you about that, yes. I would direct you, if you're really interested in understanding that, the National Institute of Standards and Technology is to building failures what the NTSB is to plane crashes. They investigate fires and building failures. They spent 10 years writing 53 engineering reports on why all the buildings fell down. Exactly why. They got pieces of the buildings, put them in furnaces to measure at what point the steel became plastic, and incredibly detailed work. One of the greatest engineering studies of any kind ever done. One of their studies is about Building 7, and I'll tell you a little story about Building 7. Toward the end of the day, point of fact, Building 7 is about 60 stories tall. It is directly across the street from the World Trade Center towers. It was not hit by the airplanes, but when the debris came shooting out of the buildings, when the airplanes hit, Building 7 was shot through with shrapnel and started to burn. So Building 7 is sitting there burning all day long while we're around the ground zero there with the footprint of the two towers. I find a bunch of firemen who have just collapsed in exhaustion right at Building 7. So I went over there to interview them. And as I'm doing that, a cop runs up and he points to Building 7 and he says, "You got to get out of here right away. That one's going to fall down." And I said what reporters always say in times like that. "Okay, officer, I'll just be another minute." Well, the firemen, who were sensibly trained to follow orders, they get up and they start heading out, and I realize it's about time to do the evening news, so I follow them out, and I walk about a block and a half to our truck that's sending our live signal out, and there's a frantic producer there who says, "We got to put you on the air right now, Building 7 collapsed." And I said, "No, it didn't. I just came from there." And he goes, "No, we got to put you on right now. Building 7 collapsed." And I said, "Look, I'm telling you, I was there 90 seconds ago. It didn't collapse." And the engineer looks at me in the truck and he says, "Look at this." And he rewinds the videotape and boom, Building 7 dropped. If I had been just another minute, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. There's been a lot of controversy about whether the towers were bombed and whether it was a CIA plot or whether Building 7 was imploded, all of that. My opinion is that the National Institute of Standards and Technology reports put all of that to rest. And we understand I read all 53 engineering reports. I learned a lot about engineering. We understand in incredible detail exactly which column started the collapse and how that happened. And it's all in the NIST reports, which are all online. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Scott, I love the title, Truth Worth Telling, and yet we're in an age now where some people will tell us we are post-truth, or at least we have alternative facts if we don't like one person's truth.
That's where journalism comes in.
Well, exactly. But the question is, how does journalism counter that when trust in journalism has declined to such an extent? I know we've had a bounce back in the last 2 years, but we also know that the partisan divide on that is extraordinary. So you have large majorities of people who self-identify as Republicans saying they don't trust the mainstream media.
Right.
And you know, it's a big concept, but I wonder what you would tell young people, but the ones you want to help save democracy, young journalists, how they can work to rebuild that trust. Because if they don't trust us, why would they take any action?
That's all we have to trade on.
Exactly.
Is our credibility. Right. If we don't have the credibility, there's no we got nothing. So there are two halves to this troubling situation. We live in this age now, first time in human history, that never before has more information been available to more people. That's a really cool thing. But it's also true that never before in human history has more bad information been available to more people. That's where journalism comes in. What can journalists do to restore trust? You know, I keep telling people, do our jobs. Do our jobs well. Show people what we do, how we do it, and what our principles are. That's what is enumerated in the book in the chapter To a Young Journalist, what our principles are, what really matters in journalism. There has been a sense, particularly among young people, and I get I'm an old dude up here talking about this, but There's been this revolution, right, in media, huge revolution in media. We don't read the newspaper on paper anymore. We read it on the phone, and we're getting the news online, and we're watching the evening news at 11 o'clock in the morning because we can stream it now and all that sort of thing. I keep telling young people that is a revolution in distribution. It's not a revolution in content. Some people have begun to think, well, if there's this enormous media revolution, then that means all the rules are changing. No, it doesn't matter if you're writing on a stone tablet or a glass tablet. The rules of content never change. Is it right? Is it fair? Is it honest? No matter how you, the audience, is receiving the information today, our obligation is the same, to give you generally reliable, independent information. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, how do I do that? How do I make a judgment? At this point in our history, I'm going to give you a very self-serving answer. And that is brand name media. If it's CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the Dallas Morning News, any paper or any organization you care to choose, if you're choosing brand name media, you at least know this, that those are people trained in journalism. They're being supervised by people who've been working in journalism for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And all the more important, they have enormous reputational risk if they get something wrong. It matters a lot to them. I'm going to make this name up. There probably is such a website, but I'm just making it up. If you're looking at AmericansForAmerica.com, they don't have any skin in the game. They're not going to be destroyed by getting something wrong, like the Chicago Tribune might be, for example. So my advice to people is, if you read something online and you're outraged by it, and we talk about this in the book, some really unscrupulous people who've created news sites that are completely fictional. If you read something online, you're outraged by it, do something you've never been able to do before. Compare that reporting with what some other people are reporting. What is CBS reporting about that? What's the Washington Post reporting about that? What is the San Diego newspaper reporting about that? And you can do something that you were never able to do before. You can look at numbers of news sources and sort of triangulate your understanding about that event. There's a man interviewed in the book that I spoke to who created two news sites that were wholly bogus. What were they called? The Denver News, and there was like National Report or something like that. One of his stories was about a town in Texas that the U.S. military had cordoned off because of an Ebola outbreak. Now, there's no Ebola outbreak. There's no town in Texas. There's no military cordon of any kind. But that story got 1 million views. And so when you read the story about the town in Texas that's been cordoned off because of the Ebola outbreak, find out what CBS is saying about that. Find out what the Washington Post is saying about that. One of the problems that we have today, and this is a huge educational issue, is that we now have, unlike we have ever had to do this before, we have to educate our viewers and our readers to be skeptical about what they're seeing and to do a little bit of work to determine what's true and what's not. We can't do it all in journalism. We can't do it all. You're going to have to defend yourself. I'm sure a lot of you people are on diets. Why? Because it's good for your body. I'm sure a lot of you people don't smoke or quit smoking. Why? Because it's good for your body. Well, now do something that's good for your brain. Seriously, there are hostile nation states polluting our information. There are cynical politicians and cynical organizations within our country that are polluting our information because why would that guy write that about the town in Texas and create this website and all of that? Because every time somebody clicked, he got a nickel. He's selling advertising. So every click is money. And he thought it was fun. So now the viewer, the reader, has got to take some responsibility. You didn't have to before because you were pretty much stuck with the 3 television networks as God intended. Or the big city newspaper. And those people were, serious journalists trying to do a serious job and were working like hell to separate fact from fiction because they would be destroyed if people stopped trusting them. Now, you don't have that luxury so much anymore, but here's the good news. It's so easy to research this stuff yourself now. You read the story about the Ebola outbreak in Texas, in 35 seconds, you could probably figure out it's false. I don't see this in the Washington Post. Surely the Post would carry this story, right? I don't see this in the New York Times. I'm beginning to wonder about the Ebola outbreak in Texas. So the reader and the viewer has an enormous responsibility, which they have never had before and will always have from this point forward. I mean, we're talking about the health of our democracy. Remember what I said earlier, fastest way to destroy a democracy, poison the information. It's already happening. That is the environment we are all sitting in right now. And all of you have the responsibility to I'm sorry, figure it out for yourself. Another, yes, please. Two more.
Mr. Pelley, you've literally been everywhere, and it seems like you've met everyone.
Today,
yes. And maybe this already happens to you, but if 60 Minutes comes to you tomorrow and says, you pick the place, you pick the person, and you pick the story, what do you want to tell that you haven't already?
I have been to the Arctic and Antarctica and everywhere in between. You are right about that. What would I do if I could do anything with anyone? I'm in the very embarrassing situation of having pretty much done that over these 30 years that I've been at CBS News. I mean, I always tell young people that journalism is the world's greatest continuing education program, right? All I do all day is research stuff and talk to fascinating people. What a job. I find Pope Francis fascinating. I did a very brief interview with Pope Francis. There's a picture in the book, but the interview was so brief there wasn't enough to put in the book. So that might be very interesting to me to sit down and have a really searching interview. I was there when he was elected Pope, and that would be a really interesting thing to do. Don't groan, but I've interviewed Donald Trump a few times. You know what I'd really like to do? I would like to have a private lunch with President Trump, just the two of us, no audience, because I'm fascinated by what is going on there. I know it sounds funny, but I'm truly fascinated by the psychology of what's going on there. When I was anchoring the evening news, all the anchors were brought to the White House to have lunch with the president because they were going to roll out this big new Middle East peace initiative. And the president was going to explain before he went to Saudi Arabia to all of the anchors exactly how this interlocking peace initiative was going to work. So we all come in, we sit down, the president's in the state dining room, we sit with the president, we start having lunch. He talks about the election. He talks about how much money he's saving the country on military contracts that he's renegotiating on the phone, and on and on and on. The entire hour winds down, and he has not said a word about the Middle East, and he gets up and walks out. Jared Kushner looks at all of us and says, well, if anybody wants to talk about the peace plan, I can tell you all about it. What's going on there? It's fascinating to me. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for your time. I was a producer at KYW News Radio in Philadelphia for a couple years, and I used to produce your show for radio.
Oh, thank you, brother. Yeah. Thank you.
Small part. But host of the evening news, it's almost like a former president's club, where there's just not many people who have had the honor in their career. My first question is, have you reached out to Jeff Gore, and what was kind of your advice? I imagine this is a pretty hard time for him and a hard transition. And the second question is, young journalists who, as journalism is transitioning and they are unfortunately being laid off, any advice to, how to come back, make it stronger, and still tell stories that are meaning?
Well, thank you for that. You're treading on tender nerves here. All anchors get fired. It just comes with the job. You're going to get fired at some point. And I believe I told Jeff that when he took over the evening news from me after I got fired. Dan Rather got fired. Walter Cronkite was forced out to make room for Dan Rather. I mean, all anchors get fired. It just comes with the job. It's only a question of how much time they give you. So what I tell young people right now is, the dynamic of the industry is hugely changed, of course. One good thing about all of this is there truly have never been more jobs. There are an enormous variety of jobs, enormous creativity in our space. I would argue that maybe we have just entered the golden age of documentaries. I mean, the Netflix of the world, the HBOs of the world, there was no home for this work before. And now they can't produce enough documentaries. And I don't know if you've been watching the shows I've been watching, but some of the docs that are coming out these days are just amazing. And so there are more homes for that kind of work than ever before, more places to work than ever before. So I tell young people, we need you. Your country needs you in journalism. We need you, but we need you to be good. Because, as I said, the quality of our democracy is bound to the quality of our journalism, the quality of the information that all of you have to make decisions in your lives and in the life of the country. Ladies and gentlemen, this has really been fun. Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. I'm grateful to you. I am very grateful to you. Thank you.